Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank you all for making it here on time. Like Cyrus said, I think there's really bad traffic out there. I don't know what's happening this morning. It's an unusual Monday morning. I also like
I do have it too.
Thank you both members. Thank you so much. Traditionally, we like to set the tone to what we should be looking at as a country each year, at the beginning of each year. And in the last 2 years, we've been focused a lot on inclusive growth, inclusive economy, inclusive growth. We all know what's been happening. We know that we've been growing, but we've been growing slower than we should be growing much slower than expected. We also know that the kind of growth we have seems to have left out some people or left out many people. And we've been talking at the summit about the kind of growth that takes everybody along. So this year we've come out with an outlook that re-emphasizes that position that we need to take people along. We need to focus on the kind of growth that will ensure that all of our people, or most of the people, are taken along. It's important to us at the summit to keep re-emphasizing this to government. We re-emphasize it again in this outlook, and we keep re-emphasizing it at every point we engage with government. The gap between the haves, or the tiny haves, and the rest of us is getting worse by the day, and we know that no economy can survive with that kind of growth pattern. So I'd like to commend the outlook to you. It's not just for business leaders to be able to plan, project, and determine the direction of the businesses. It's for all of us. More importantly, it's for the government of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. And we think it's time government started paying serious attention to some of the issues that have been raised, because we can't continue as we continue as we're going on. So again, I commend the outlook to you. Please listen. We'll make short presentations, and then we'll take questions and answers. But hopefully, my board members have said we need to be prepared more now. So we'll try and make it maybe 1 hour 15 minutes or something. But I commend this outlook to you. Please listen very carefully. And if you have any suggestions for us, we'll take them, we'll welcome them. And if you have any questions, we'll take them and we'll respond to them. But we are clear in our minds at the Nigerian Economic Summit that Nigeria must grow. Nigeria must try and grow in double digits, but that growth must be growth that includes everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your opening remarks. So we'll take the presentation for... We'll take the presentation, a brief presentation, technical presentation from Head of Research at the Economic Summit Group, Dr. Shegun Mishaki. Dr. Shegun.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Mr. Chairman and the board members. We're going to go straight to what we have in the report, as the chairman has said. The essence of the presentation is to commit to you some of the arguments that are made in this report, something that can encourage debate on the way forward for the Nigerian economy, especially when we look at the need for us to grow in an inclusive manner. Okay, so the presentation has two parts. The first part is we will look at the state of the Nigerian economy in 2018. We'll also quickly look at the outlook for 2019. And then, given the outlook, we then see the need for us to consider inclusive growth in Nigeria. What are the main strategies that we can explore? Okay, so to start with, the basic idea of growth anyway, globally, is not just to assume or to achieve high growth, but it's also to have some fundamental questions as to what type of growth do we need, or what type of growth are we talking about, and who are supposed to be the benefit of this growth, and what are the outcomes of the growth. This forms the basic background upon which different growth models globally, whether from developing country or the advanced countries, are based, especially when the question of inclusive growth is concerned. And so we think as a nation we need to start a discussion from this perspective. Now, to also put things in context, we look at briefly the World Bank report that from 1990 to 2015 that considers the growth population, global population in terms of poverty. And one striking point here is that when you look at 1990, you have Nigeria, Sub-Saharan Africa having about 13% of the global poor people out of about 2.1 billion. That was in 1990. If you look at 2015, both Asian continent, East Asia, Pacific, and South Asia were able to drastically reduce the number of people living in poverty to the extent that from 13%, that's what SSA represents. Now in 2015 we are having about 50%. So that informs why other reports critically looks into the SSA and then bring out Nigeria to say Nigeria is indeed the global capital of poverty. This, though not encouraging, but speaks to the need for us to look into how we grow. So quickly, I will just look at what happens in the Nigerian economy. Yes, the growth is there, especially after the recession in 2016, but the growth has been very, weak. Apart from the fact that we're not growing as we need to grow, one of the salient points is that when a country wants to go into recession, this is how growth looks like. The growth will be slow over time, and then if the momentum is not sustained, then it might likely come down again. And we've seen here that the growth is still being sustained by the activity in the oil sector. So where oil goes, that's when the growth goes in the case of Nigeria. And this is against this idea of diversification of public documents. And if we look specifically by sectors, we see that the oil sector is still the dominant determinant of growth in the case of Nigeria. Okay. So now, we've seen how weak we are. We were in 2018. The idea is we need to do more in 2019. We see what are the policies that are likely to influence the growth outlook this year. We were able to come up with some of the points in number one, which we all know the general election, which appears to be getting serious negative momentum now. If case not taken from that side, we think this might be major determinants of economic development of growth this year. We look also at what happens to the passage of 2018 budget. Already been delayed, but it might take maybe the third quarter before we get it finally passed. And the implication will also be there. Okay, so especially from the outlook we see from both the executive and the so these are some of the events or policies that we think will shaping how economic activity or development strategy might unfold next year. Now, based on this, we were able to come out with some quantitative projections into the outlook this year. So we have, as usual, 3 scenarios. These scenarios are governed also by main 3 assumptions around our oil price and oil production and government capital expenditure. So the first optimistic scenario, which if Nigeria will be much more serious in the implementation of the policies and actualization of some of the goals that we have set,
would be for us to grow, for instance, by 3% for the year. The second, which happens to be a business as usual, we feel that the situation will still be like the same, and at the end of the year, maybe we'll do around 2.1% in terms of growth. But the third one seems to be of interest, even though it's just a matter of worst case scenario. But this might be looking, like something that might happen, because the economy is based on oil, and the oil projection now globally is not looking good. Oil price rather, and again you see the global economy, global growth is not faring better, with consideration on the economy of the US and the China and some other world powers. So this might impact demand for oil, and price of oil also might fall further. Right. So we have looked at these three different projections, and we think that there is need for the Nigerian government to consider, especially the oil production. And since we are, of course, under the court, Nigeria is even part of the countries. Nigeria and Libya, we are now expected to reduce our production, given the OPEC court. Now, straight we go to why we need to strengthen our idea or ideology of growth beyond just talking about oil, because we've seen that the best scenario we have here will not still give us the strong growth. We are talking about 3.1 at best. Now, the idea is that our growth eludes many people. Large number of the populations are not carried along with growth, because the sectors that are driving our growth are so few. Many sectors or subsectors are not contributing anything. As a matter of fact, you have just about about 6 sectors are the one driving the whole economy. So this is the situation of the rising economic and social challenges that we have in Nigeria, and it's so serious. So this informed the choice for us at the Nesg to say, for us to grow, we need to still base our growth idea on inclusive growth model. The inclusive growth model is based on 3 pillars. The first one is that there is need for a broad-based growth. We need to grow, first of all, before we think about people that are excluded. And this growth must be broad-based. In other words, more sectors must be seen to contribute to this, and it must be sustained over time. And again, there must also be a social inclusion. We must look at as basic social sectors like health and education strongly, to make sure that we are not just clamoring about growth, but people's lives are also taken care of. Human capital development. As a way of illustration, we look at some selected countries at how they fare in terms of the human capital development and institutions. In other words, how government were able to influence decisions in both industries, in both sectors, national planning and the rest. And we discover a very interesting scenario here, that most countries that are highly ranked in terms of the human capital development and are also highly ranked in terms of strong institutions, and they happen to be the developed countries. And those countries also that are poorly ranked by human capital development, and at the same time be poorly ranked by institutions, happens to be developing countries, and Nigeria happens to be one of the kingmakers there. And so we think for us to discuss inclusive growth, Nigeria must have a way of moving from quadrant C. Either we go through D by strengthening our institution, or we go through B by putting more investment on our human capital development. In whatever form, we need to consider these 2 ways and make sure that we move closer. We see China, who is already getting closer to that side. To end this presentation, we have basic reforms that we think that the government should look into in trying to influence the inclusive growth strategy. The first one happens to be on the growth of industry. We call it industry governance. In other words, there must be a strong setting of national and subnational or state level agendas. We must have a strong national plan that says this is where we are going, something that goes beyond the ARGP something that carries along the state's economy, so that we don't just plan for at the national level, leaving the state levels. Most states are not even able to pay ordinary wages, so we should be able to consider that. The next thing is that there is need for us to also develop a new idea or review the existing ones on social inclusion strategy. We know what the government is trying to do now, giving people some money, feeding kids in schools, and these are just programs. This may not really speak to how to fundamentally address the problem of social exclusion. And we think there is need for a country to look at the national philosophy of social exclusion. What do we mean by social exclusion or inclusion? What happens at the state level? Again, we also think that there is need for a better policy coordination within the federal government and among states, and again federal government to state level. This is on the industry governance. The last one that we consider is on the social inclusion and good governance. We think we need to look, as I said, at the social inclusion strategy closely. There is a program called PETS that have been replicated in most of the developing countries now, especially in the East Africa, that was introduced by the World Bank, and it's called the Public Expenditure Tracking System. The idea is to say, you track your money, you follow your money. You don't just say, okay, we budget this in the budget, this is how much we're going to spend on expenditure, on capital, on this, and you don't know where these monies are going. So we think there is need for government to strengthen that, to know how much we spend on what, and to get the exact outcome of our spending. Also, we look at the National Strategic Health Development Plan that was just launched or prepared this year. We've gone through some of the recommendations, and we think these are what the government should look into critically to develop the state of health sector and education in Nigeria. So this report just gives out an idea that we need to look inward. We need to look into how do we move from here beyond the usual way of saying, oh, this is our national plan, 3-year plan, ARGP, and the rest. To make sure that the nation leave this point, we need to do something very radical. We need to look inward and see how do we. The trend is going up, and this is even 2015, not 2018. So this is the idea behind this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we take questions, I'd like to ask the chairman of the Committee on Research and Publication, Dr. Islam, to say a few words, and we'll take questions.
Right. Thank you very much, and good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. Well, what Dr. Omishaki has presented is the outlook for 2019. But let me do a couple of things. I think I will speak from a slightly non-technicalese perspective. The best case scenario that they've painted, I think, is unlikely. I don't see oil prices at $75. The business case that we presented, I would argue, is more likely. But I think we have to be mindful of a fundamental assumption, which is that the elections are successful. It's not about who wins or who doesn't. It's about successful elections. That's the first thing to put on the table. That the biggest downside risk that Nigeria faces is the elections in a couple of weeks' time. It's not about, Nigeria remains an oil story, fundamentally. And that again goes to some of the assumptions. Nigeria is unlikely in 2019 to produce 2 million barrels of crude oil. And the reason is simple. Our OPEC quota is 1.6, excluding condensates. And if you add condensates, tops 300,000, you're talking 1.9. The oil price numbers are not looking as good as we would like. U.S. interest rates are likely to be higher on the back of higher U.S. bonds. So all of these put us in a position where we need successful elections after which we can recoup and then think through what happens next. That's the first point. The second point, too, is that Dr. Mishaki was speaking about poverty and this economy is just recovering from a recession. And I'm not sure that we have fully grasped the impact and the import of the recession through which we have gone. A little study that I am party to, conducted in Lagos, Rivers, and Kano, shows that in the last 10 years, Nigerian households have become more defensive. What does that mean? They are spending more on food and non-alcoholic beverages. The NPS's numbers for 2009, which is the latest that they've got, show that in 2009, about half, 51% of total spend was on food and non-alcoholic beverages. But by November last year, when this study was carried out, it's a very small sample study, I think it's probably about 2,000 households across. But Lagos had the best at 59% of household income now being spent on food and non-alcoholic beverages. Rivers, I think, was about 64%. Kano was about 69%. In other words, the gentle drift that we had seen between 2003 and 2009, when Nigeria seemed to be moving from being a subsistence economy towards lifestyle, appears to have been badly affected by the recession. And so the challenge of our recovery is, even in my view, much deeper. So that's households under pressure. Corporates are also under pressure. Any analysis of the inflation numbers, there are two sets of inflation numbers. There is the one which we are all more familiar with, which is the consumer price index. That is rising at slightly over 11%. But there is a second one, which economists in technicalese would call the deflator, but which I would simply say is the cost of production rather than the cost of consumption. And guess what? That is rising faster than the consumer price index, which means corporates are hemorrhaging profits. And so the challenge of sustaining employment is a very, very real challenge that we will have to figure a way of addressing. And may I then suggest that, yes, this one-year outlook is useful and interesting. But I think a more pressing need for Nigeria is to re-articulate a vision for this country. I think the Saudis have now done 2030 or is it 2050. Nigeria's visioning document expires next year, 2020. And the key question is, what next? What next? What's going to be Nigeria's targets over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years, over the next 15 years? Because without articulating these, it becomes very difficult to invite the private sector, or indeed any other sector, to key in to government programming, to determine what policies do we need to adopt. We are already very clear that Nigeria is capital short. The central bank, in its communique after the MPC last week, drew trenchant attention to Nigeria's indebtedness and its consequences. And so how do we free up private capital to replace government spending? What do we need to do that enables Executive Order 7, for example, in my view, is a step in the right direction. But what else do we need to do that brings private sector capital onto the table and allows infrastructure to be upgraded rapidly and allows it to be expanded meaningfully? Because failure to do all of these, we are not going to get very far. failure to address the issues around education, we are not going to get very far as a country. I noted Dr. Mishakin's point around the need for growth, and sorry, economics conversations have moved beyond that. Economics now fully understands the need for inclusive growth. So it's not that old chestnut about growth or development. No, both must go hand in hand, and which is what the graph around human development that he spoke to also, clearly implies. And so for me, my own key comment is that 2019 will succeed to the extent that the elections succeed. If the elections are not, shall I say, for process, a repeat or a replica of 2015, they've got a problem. Don't forget, even in 2015, there was a 15-minute period when we thought all hell, forgive my language, when we thought things were not going to go the way we wanted them to. But eventually, the electoral results were announced and we were back on track. And so this time, we do need successful elections. Don't also forget, 2015, successful elections in Nigeria were followed by a disastrous election in Kenya. It's always interesting when you read what the Kenyans have to say about us and corruption. Maybe we should reply about them and elections, but that's a different matter for another time. But for me, Nigeria does need successful elections. It's an imperative, or else our capital shortage will continue. Our ability to drive the economy expansively and meaningfully will be reduced, and the ability to make a dent on the 23% unemployment that we currently have to deal with and its social implications will be very severely curtailed. And so for me, ladies and gentlemen, 2019 for me is really only about two things. One, elections. Two, oil prices and oil quantities. End of story. Everything else, once the elections are successfully declared, we can come back and deal with them. Again, thank you very much for showing up this morning, and I commend this outlook document to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salami. I'd just like to say that the Economic Summit Group intends to catalyze the process of visioning for Nigeria. We will start that conversation, and we hope government will take it over from us. And if they don't, we'll provide something for Nigeria. We'll take questions, and maybe we'll take them in batches of 3. Dr. Mishaki.
Because people cannot speak and then not answer
please
questions.
Come forward, because we'll answer your questions.
It's important.
It's not us here that will answer your questions, your presentation. Except there are questions to
the chairman,
to the board, or to Dr. Salami. Short of that,
stand over there.
Questions?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Please just mention your name and where you work, and let's go straight to your question. Okay, so we'll start with the gentleman in glasses there. Thank you. Any roving mic? Okay, we'll share this one. Thank you. Here.
Thank you. Good morning once again. My name is Giorgio Adebimpe. I work for RAND National Plan. I have 2 questions for Dr. Onishi. Without prejudice to what was written in the document, which I haven't gone through in detail, but it would be good if you could shed more light. You mentioned, talking about inclusive growth, you mentioned the role of states, government. So, you didn't say much about that. We know that the federal government is trying to make some effort, which we're not sure will really translate to the inclusion we're looking for. So, what your own view, do you think state government and even maybe local government should be doing to get involved in this? That's my question. My second question is on the projection, the economic outlook, the growth outlook, and co. In your view, do you think whatever is the outcome of the general elections, especially looking at the two leading candidates, as of today, may have any impact on this projection, whether the incumbent or if a new president emerges, would that swing things? Maybe materially, maybe not. Thanks.
Good morning, Macroeconomic, Mitsubishi, Nigeria. I've got two questions, or maybe a question and a comment. From what I see, I'd say we've got a government that struggles to listen. So if these comments and prognoses that you've suggested are not taken on by the government, what you suggest? That's the first question. And the other one is, how are we going to respond to things like the budget? Okay, let me rephrase that. Is it possible that the Nesg could present an alternative budget? It might not be implemented, might not be listened to, but can we present one where we say, realistically, the government has said oil production is 2, realistically we won't do 1.5. Oil prices are X, we believe it's more like Y. Is it possible? Thanks.
I work for Visual Field. I have some response to the presentation. The first is on the budget. I think it is dangerous for us to state that the 2019 budget will be passed with a deficit. Rather, I think we should have a plan from when the National Assembly convenes on the 19th to make sure that the budget is passed within the first quarter. Now, the National Assembly will terminate in June.
and with interest rate at a higher level, we know what that means. But one of the things that I think is missing here is that it's not just about what we do in Nigeria, just indeed the US interest rate suggests. When it comes to Africa, I think there is a major shift going on in Africa that we are not taking cognizance of. I talk, in particular, I was going to come to that at the end. I talk about Egypt. Egypt is positioned itself as a major recipient of capital from the rich Middle Eastern countries, but not just that, from around the world as well. South Africa is beginning to change its narrative since Cyril became president. And I imagine after the elections this year, they're going to make more progress in that regard. But for me, the most important thing that's happening in Africa that will impact capital flows to and out of Nigeria is Ethiopia. I mean, just the way we got a bit interested in what happened in Ghana those days is the way we must as a country get interested in what is happening in Ethiopia today. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind at all. When Abiy, the Prime Minister, spoke in Davos, there were no seats for people. It was full. I got in early because he had told me the previous day when we met that he was going to do this. So I got in early, and I was just inspired, after we had met earlier. It's amazing what investors are thinking about Ethiopia today. And I think for me, if our leaders are sleeping without a headache, then maybe they're on something. Thank you.
Yes.
The forensic bank governor will also be ending his tenure. Do you still see us growing and developing with the way the monetary policy issues have been handled in the last 4 years? And what about the security issues around Niger Delta? I know we've had some respite in some few months. Do you see that being sustained? The point around the vision is very, very strong, and I don't know if and how we intend to put this together. Thank you.
Tendency of becoming heavily dependent on borrowed funds, especially outside of the country. And vis-a-vis the strategy to attract private capital, whether outside of the country or within the country, because I think that there's a huge issue that we're not speaking to. We've borrowed ourselves to a level that might be very unhealthy. And if that trajectory continues, what will be the long-term implications that we may not be noting now? And therefore, what are the alternative ways of funding as opposed to continuous borrowing? Very recently, we've even started borrowing from third world countries, and that's really what got me seriously concerned. So I'm just asking if you speak to what those implications are, and therefore, what kind of recommendations we should be making in terms of the strategy for doing otherwise. Thank you.
My name is Ibrahim Diko Adonu. I work for the IFC.
Sorry, Ibrahim?
Ibrahim Diko Adonu. I work for the IFC. The first is more or less a comment based on what Frank had said about Ethiopia. In the latest investment trend monitoring report of the United Nations Trade and Development, we saw for the first time Ghana receiving more FDI than Nigeria. Interestingly enough, Egypt, South Africa, and I believe Kenya, a few other countries, receive also more flows. And Angola and Nigeria, which were more natural resource economies that are reliant on natural resources, receive less FDI. If you look at the total FDI that came into Africa, I think Nigeria got about 2-point-something billion and Ghana got 3-point-something billion. So that's food for thought. In terms of what Ethiopia is doing, we've heard a lot about its clusters, how it has moved, and it's capturing the market, that the textile apparel market that the Chinese are now leaving, and that is coming, going to Ethiopia, and how special economic zones are working for them. So another food for thought. But my real question here is, every problem has an input side and an output side. When we talk about growth and how our numbers are not strong enough and are now outpacing our population numbers, does the NESG have any report, or does it intend, and perhaps it has in the past, has it said anything about population growth and how we need to, that's one problem I think we also need to take a look at from the, I don't know, from the output side perhaps. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take that last question. So that
Good morning, everybody. My name is Emeka Eke. I work with Standard Chartered Bank. The mention of inclusive growth reminds me of GSM revolution when it happened in Nigeria. And I think it was an event that created wealth for a lot of people, right down to the grassroots, if one can say. My question is, what other area do we think that is like a new frontier that can have that kind of mass effect, right? Irrespective of whoever has a license or whatever, the activities that come from that will have a mass bandwagon effect in terms of pulling a lot of people up the chain. Related to that, there has been the suggestion of unbundling NMPC. One of the summit think of that. Can that be a new frontier that can have a similar effect? And if properly done, what do you think will be the impact on FDI into Nigeria? Thank you.
Okay. We'll start with Dr. Shaki. We'll take the question and round up.
Okay. So let me start by just letting you know with respect to whether we have specific reports or any report at all that talks to population dynamics and the rest within the South. We have other reports that we produce annually, monthly, and in each of those reports we talk about this serious problem of population growth rate. So we don't, but for now we don't have a specific report that looks to that. So you can always check other reports to see what we've talked about. Yeah, the issue of funding or borrowing is key. Even though we know that economies that grow also has this tendency to borrow to grow, but to share the concern of CBN governor. The government has tried in one way or the other to reject both the domestic and the external growth and the external borrowing by saying, okay, let's have more of our borrowing internally. But that has not really worked. And we also know that going forward, that the tendency to keep borrowing might be increasing much more than what we are experiencing now. But I personally feel that until we look to the role of private sector in development, there is no country that parades itself as being competitive that neglects the role of private sector. So the government must look into how private sector factor is considered when it comes to growth funding, when it comes to infrastructure. I'm also aware that recently the government passed a bill, infrastructure, maybe private bill, so that it gives the private sector the ability to go ahead with maybe construction of roads that, yes, something that is good. So I think this is coming somehow, this should have happened since. And I think it's one of the ways through which you can practically, not just say the private sector should come, but practically engage them. They have the money, just change just convert and say, okay, spend the money, then I'll do this. So I think it's a lot of issues, but that still speaks to how the whole macroeconomic turns out. It's not just about, oh, do we increase rate or do we reduce rate to do this? The health of an economy also signals what is going to happen to how you borrow. Okay, so I think that's.
Right. I think the question about private participation and monetary policy now actually puts me in a fairly difficult position, because I have, since 2017, avoided saying anything about monetary policy, having left membership of the MPC. So I'm going to skirt monetary policy. You will forgive me, but I will make slightly more. The strategy that's fraught with risk, simply because we are dependent on oil, and when oil prices don't behave the way we want them to, then it creates a problem for us. And we know that more often than not, oil will not behave the way we want them to. So if we want private capital to come into infrastructure, whether it's electricity or any other, my sense is that Nigeria needs to understand certain imperatives. Imperative number one, the currency must be managed to be growth promoting. My experience of policy making, and this is not just MPC. I had a short role on the economic management team in 2009, if I recall correctly. Is that Nigerian policy making tends to assume that a strong currency is synonymous with a virile economy. We've seen other countries deliberately do the opposite. I'm not saying, please understand me carefully, no country leaves its currency unmanaged. None, not even the Americans. But you've got to understand management to what purpose. And that, for me, I'm not sure we have articulated. Instead, we have become fixated on a strong currency. Unfortunately, as the Asians have shown us, a strong currency tends to export jobs rather than it imports goods and exports jobs. So, for me, that's number one. Number two, you need an enabling environment of legislation, policy, regulation, and mindset that speaks to a decent role. We don't have to be afraid of the private sector or of private capital. I keep repeating this year in, year out. Nigeria's master plan, infrastructure master plan, says we spend $100 billion every year for 3 decades in order to expand and upgrade our infrastructure. That's supposed to have started in 2012. I doubt if we have, in the whole of the period since 2012, 8-9 years since, I would be surprised if our total spend has exceeded $30–40 billion. I really doubt it. And so, if that is the rate at which we are going relative to the rate we define as the rate we must go, then you can already see that we've got to reach that capital shortage. And it's only going to happen if you have legislation, regulation, policy, and a mindset in government that says private sector can and should be encouraged, not even should be allowed. There's a difference between let's allow them to do it and encourage them to do it. It's not about domestic capital, it's not about, it's capital, whether it's domestic or it's international. Why would international capital come if domestic capital is leaving? So for me, you need these in order to be able to, just imagine, for sake of argument, $100 billion a year. Sake of argument, really sake of argument. Nigeria was getting $20 billion of inflow into infrastructure. That changes the whole currency debates. It changes the whole reserve discussion. It changes a whole load of stuff. I'm not saying that it's not fraught, that it has no downsides of its own, but this can be managed. I keep telling people, Nigeria today is where China was 40 years ago. 40 years ago, 8 out of 10 Chinese were poor. Today, less than 2% of China's population is poor. And the Chinese reckon that within the next 2-3 years, they will take all their population out of poverty. So these are the kinds of things that must help us to define and push for a vision. To GDP every year. So instead of growing at 2%, we'll be growing at between 4 and 6. Instead of growing at 4%, we'll be doing between 6 and 10. And these are the kinds of growth. Today we say China is slowing down and we are worried. So guess what? It's 6.5% is what we are worried. And that was because China used to do 11%. And so Nigeria must move with a mentality which says the first industrial revolution took 200 years. The fourth industrial revolution, the third industrial revolution, which the Asians ran, took about 40 years. The fourth and ongoing industrial revolution will probably take half that time, which is why the examples being quoted around Ethiopia, around Rwanda, indeed next door Ghana, are examples that are worthy of some attention. Because the world doesn't owe us a living. If we wait, we will, look, we've been potentially great since I was in school. Well, I didn't want to tell everybody asked me how old I am. But seriously, this country has no business growing at 2%. It indeed, I would argue, has no business growing at 6%. How does it take us 12 years to build a rail line and well? How does it see? All of these are the issues. Education is the second sector that I would point to as being an enabler for Nigeria. The world, I don't know how many of you are following WEF. About a week or two ago, they published a list of jobs that are going to be relevant 20 years from now. Guess what? It's not the jobs we're going to. So if our education can't even suit today, then imagine how less suitable it is for the future. So for me, until and unless, my attention was drawn to the fact that when I was planning to go to secondary school, admission into a government college was it. That was what we were all chasing. It doesn't matter whether it was a federal government college or a state government college. As long as it wrote government college, you really wanted to be admitted. But today, nobody is interested. Because what has happened to us in 30 years of education, I draw attention, in the 1960s, what has become UI was the fourth best tertiary institution in the Commonwealth. It is said, and I don't know how true, that Saudi royalty used to come to UCH in Ibadan. Today, UCH is one of the centers for cancer treatment, but the machine. So, all of these are things that must change. So, for me, art and education are sine qua non. It's not arguable. We don't do that, we are not going very far. As far as infrastructure is concerned, the private sector will do it if you enable them to do it, if you encourage them to do it. That's why that markets fail. I have no problem with that. That's the goal of regulators. So for me, and somebody mentioned population, municipalities are against that one. So we will have to defer that conversation for another time. Thank you.
Maybe I should start with those municipalities that we get. Seriously, I know there have been conversations around population, strong conversations. We know we have to find a way to manage our population. Politics, sometimes religion, lot of things have come through it. But if we don't manage our population, then many things are going to go pear-shaped. So that's clear. No matter how difficult that decision is, we have to take it at the point. Let me say something. Albert, I want to go to where you talked about not caring which parts of wings. Technically, I myself it is different. I think the key is what happens thereafter. And that's where we all have to focus on and ensure that this time round the right policies are determined and implemented. That's the key. Doing talks about power, unlocking power. We've been trying to unlock power since 2002. No, 2002. That's when the implementation committee was established. And the law was passed in 2005, 2006. And we're still there today. We haven't gone very far. We've even gone backwards if we look at it critically. So I think the determination on the part of leadership is so fundamental. With what's going on around the world, if we don't have leadership that's determined to determine that we need to grow and come from being seventh in the world. And that's because there's no investment in this sector. And our leadership notices, but we still don't do what we should do. So we all should try and put pressure on our leadership to do what we need to do. It's fundamental. Capital inflows, I won't repeat what Dwayne has said, but it's clear, it's the policy choices we make. Capital is like water. It flows to the areas of least resistance. If you send money somewhere, you want your money, you want to be sure your money will come back safely with a premium, and that the things you've invested your money in are things that are value-adding things. You know, that's the principles for capital are not complicated. So we complicate those principles. We should try to uncomplicate them. Shea, you talked about vision. I think Tony has responded to that. Emeka, okay, your question has been responded to also. So I think we've taken all the questions. In closing, I want to direct this at Frank, my colleague on the board, who runs the thriving business newspaper in this country. Frank, you're using your paper positively, but I think you need to use it even more positively. We all need to put pressure on government. Don't be afraid that they think you're on the other side or you're the enemy.
I don't care.
Once you're speaking truth to power, I think it's fundamental. We need to make government pay attention on the serious things. We know this is the funny season and nobody's paying attention to serious things apart from wanting to win the election at all costs. But I think we need to make government, whichever government, pay attention to serious things. If not, in 10 years' time, we will be really in the backwoods of Africa, and that would be a disaster for a population of nearly 300 million at that time. We'll be kind of looking at each other and wondering who you want to eat. Thank you very much. No, we're not taking any more questions. I think we need to, people need to get back to the office. What I just want to say is that I want to commend this outlook to everybody here. We'll be doing a lot more work at the summit this year, particularly we're going to be working to provide some base for any new government, and we hope they'll take us as seriously as we expect them to, and as they have in the past, and we'll keep on working at it. We will work on a visionary position for the country, and we'll also work on a developmental framework for the country. We at the summit will do our very best to encourage and catalyze the process, and we'll keep on working with government, imploring government, begging government, encouraging government, and hoping that one day government, challenging government, will challenge them. But I'm beginning to see that with government people, we need to be a mix of challenge and beg. But the important thing is to get Nigeria going. So let me take begging with beg. Thank you very much. I commend the outlook to you. Thank you for coming and have a wonderful morning. Yes, sorry. You want to launch? I'm not used to those. Can I ask my question, please?
And don't be shy.
Where's the dog? Dog, they say you wrote this thing. Yes, Salami, can I ask the board members present, please? All the board members present, please. And on behalf of the board and management of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, I'd like to launch our macroeconomic outlook for 2019. Usually we would say to the glory of God and to the betterment of our country. Definitely to the glory of God and to the betterment of our country. We'll commend this to you. Please read it. Like I said, if there are things you want to challenge or come back to us on, please do so that we can always do this much better. But it's critical that we also encourage our policymakers to read this. If we do not have an inclusive growth, we're going nowhere. You know, the security situation will be even much worse than what we have now. And we can't have all our people so poor. We can't remain the poverty capital of the world. Nigeria has to be serious about its growth, and this growth must be inclusive. Thank you very much.
Should I move?
Okay, done. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, my dear. God bless you.
Yeah, I was good. I'm not getting it this morning. No, you're getting it. How late? No, it's okay. We'll work on this today, and then once we get that.